All right, so in chapter 3, we kind of switched gears back to data. In chapter 1, we looked at data with one variable, both categorical and quantitative. Chapter 3 is now looking at two variables at the same time. Eventually, we'll do it both for categorical and quantitative. This video is going to focus mostly more on categorical data. So often two variable data for categorical variables is reported in something called a two-way table. And a two-way table just displays data for two categorical variables about the same group of individuals. So often we took one big sample, but we recorded two pieces of information, and we want to look at a table that has the breakdown of how those people work, or what happened to those people. So for example, surveys given to 150 randomly selected adults, asking both their gender and their favorite sport to watch on TV. And then here are the results. So this is a two-way table because we have information about the males going in one direction, information about their favorite sport to watch in the other direction. Sometimes the tables will be on, or the totals will be on there. Sometimes they won't. So just watch for that. You may have to calculate them yourself. One of the things you need to know is the difference between a marginal distribution and a conditional distribution. And really, you need to know marginal relative frequencies and conditional relative frequencies. So the marginal distributions are the totals for one categorical variable. So for example, the yellow box here is the marginal distribution of gender because that's the total for each gender. The red box is the marginal distribution of opinion because that's the total for each of the opinion of which sport they prefer. And there are times where they might ask you to do some calculations with those marginal totals. Or some relative frequencies, which relative frequency is another way of saying percent. Conditional distributions are now the distributions within just one value of one variable. So for example, this blue box is the conditional distribution of favorite sport. So among females, that's the condition. Under the condition that we're looking only at the females, this is the conditional distribution of sports, favorite sport among females. We can do the same with males. That's the conditional distribution of males. But you can also do conditions going the other direction. So if I look at this green box, the green box right now is on the conditional distribution of gender, because I have the breakdown of male-female, among people whose favorite sport is basketball. And so there would be three conditional distributions here because here's the breakdown of gender for football, here's the breakdown of gender for basketball, here's the breakdown of gender for baseball. And I'm trying to use the terms so you understand what they mean. For the most part, your questions about two-way tables aren't going to be super heavily on knowing, is that a marginal question or a conditional question? But you need to be aware that we sometimes look at totals, and I care about how many males or females are our total or favorite sports total. Sometimes we look very specifically within one group. So one of the things I will have you do and you need to be ready to do is to calculate both marginal relative frequencies and conditional relative frequencies. Kind of the keys are just the words themselves. If we're talking marginal relative frequencies, then we're looking in the margins. So one margin will be over here, one margin's along the bottom. Specifically, we are looking, and then when we talk about relative frequency, in general, relative frequency means percentage of some total. And in this case, we're using the total from the margin because it's a marginal relative frequency. We're using the total in the margin, so out of everyone, the total, to answer whatever question we're looking at. Conditional means we're looking at under one condition. So we're looking at just part of one group. I'm just looking at the females, or I'm just looking at the males, or I'm just looking at one of the sports. And we're looking for percentages just of that group. So if I'm looking under the condition of female, I might look at 16 out of all of the females, which is 73. So when you're going to do the relative frequency part, you're only using the total for that group instead of the total for the entire table. So just a couple examples. If we wanted to calculate the relative marginal frequency for favorite sport, for football, if I'm looking at a relative marginal frequency for football, I'm looking at all of the football, people who watch football. out of everyone, 52 over 100, and then you can crunch the value out. And just, I mentioned this last chapter, but when you're typing these in, make sure you round correctly. Oops, I don't want that. There is no rule about how many decimal places, so if I'm doing probabilities, I often go 3 or 4. But you should not have 0.34, you should not have 0.346. It should either be 0.35 or 0.347 because those next decimals are all 5 or bigger. And again, if I want the relative marginal frequency for basketball, I am looking at how many people total play basketball out of how many people total. I'm using totals in the margins for everything that I do. Baseball, same thing. There's 60 total play baseball out of 150 total. Oh, whoops, I can crunch those out. If I want to look at a conditional relative frequency, now we need to pay attention to their wording, of gender among people whose favorite sport is baseball. So I'm only looking at this group where people whose favorite sport is baseball. Excuse me. So I am only concerned with this group of numbers, and I'm looking at the breakdown of gender. So out of the people whose favorite sport is baseball, there are 15 males out of 60 people total, which is 25%. There are 45 females out of 60 people total whose favorite sport is baseball, which is 75. Well, that's a typo, which is 75%. Now, I could switch to a different condition. If I want to calculate the conditional relative frequency of favorite sport among males, then I'm looking at just that group of number, actually including the total. So now I'm looking just at the males and doing breakdowns of percentages in there. So the conditional relative frequency for football would be the 40 people of the males out of the 77 males whose favorite sport is football. For basketball, same thing. There are 22 of the males out of the 77 total of males whose favorite sport is basketball, and baseball would be 15 out of the 77. So marginal frequencies, you're only working in the margins. You're looking at just total out of the total of everything. For conditionals, you're using the total for one of the conditions. You're using the total just for one of the columns or one of the rows. Now, to be perfectly honest, the most likely scenario that you're going to see are like the questions that I'm going to show you in a second here, which don't really use the terms marginal and conditional distributions. You just have to kind of get used to the way they're worded. Oh, that's a question about everybody, or this is a question about a certain group. So, what percentage of the people surveyed said basketball was their favorite sport to watch on television? So they didn't specify any group or anything, ask you to look only at part of this. They just want to know how many chose basketball. So there are 38 people whose favorite sport was basketball out of 150 total. So 0.253. Next, of the people who said football was their favorite sport to watch on television, what percentage were male? So we're only looking at the football group, and we want to know percentage is female, so that's 12 out of the 52 people who said football was their favorite sport to watch, which would be 0.231. Next, of the people who are male, so we're only looking at the male group, what proportion said their favorite sport to watch on TV is baseball? Oh, they also changed the word proportion. Proportion and percentage are used pretty interchangeably throughout the year, so don't be thrown off by that. What proportion said their favorite sport to watch on TV is baseball? So we're only looking at the males. So 15 out of the 77 males, which is 0.195. And then what proportion of people surveyed were female? Now we're not narrowing in any particular group, either by sport or by gender. They just want to know what proportion were female. So that's 73 out of the 150 total, which is 0.487. So these are the most likely questions on the AP test that you would see involving these, but you need to know what those conditional and marginal distributions are as well. Now, along with just looking at the 2A table, we often also want to make some displays out of that, some actual graphs that give you a little more visual idea of what's going on. So one option is a side-by-side bar graph, which really is just you make a bar graph, and to show that second variable, you have more than one bar. So for example, this is a frequency bar graph. A lot of times these side-by-side bar graphs, they'll make into relative frequencies where these are percentages, but the numbers here are fairly small, so I just made a frequency side-by-side bar graph. But basically what I do is, for this one, I decided to have the sports be my main like categories along the bottom. And then within each sport, I'm going to have a bar for the male. So I have one bar that goes to 40 because there were 40 males who said football was their favorite sport. And I'll have a bar for the females that goes up to 12. Then I do the same thing for the next sport. I have 22 males who said basketball. I have 16 females who said basketball. Then I have 15 males who said baseball and 45 females who said baseball. So it's a 2-variable graph because I have one variable on the bottom. Within each of those, I have my other variable measured with different bars. Now you could do this kind of in the other order. You could have a bar for male, like a males and females along the bottom, and you could have 3 bars. You could have, under the male label, you could have a bar for football, a bar for basketball, a bar for baseball, all side by side. And then above the females, you could have a bar for football, bar for basketball, bar for baseball. So when you're making a graph out of these, there's not like an automatic, oh, you have to put a certain variable on the axis and the other one your bars. But this is one example of a side-by-side bar graph. And the nice thing is, when you're just staring at numbers, sometimes it's hard to see trends. But we can clearly see here some things like, oh, well, basketball tends to be the closest between the genders. There is definitely a much higher preference among females for baseball and a much higher preference among males for football. So it's a lot easier to see some different trends and things that are going on, but pretty straightforward to make. The last one we're going to look at in this video is a segmented bar chart. A segmented bar chart is one that shows categorical data most often as a percentage of the whole. I will show you a couple questions I've come across where they did it with counts instead of percentage, but that's much less likely. So kind of like that side-by-side bar graph, a segmented bar chart could be in 2 different ways of looking at it. You could have a bar for each sport. So I would have a football bar, a basketball bar, a baseball bar. And then you would divide that bar up based on what percentage was male and what percentage was female for each sport. You also could have a bar for each gender. So I have one bar that represents all the males, one bar that represents all the females, and then divide the bar by sport. And that's what we're going to do in the little example here. So this bar represents 100% of the males, and this bar represents 100% of the females. When you're doing with this percents, it doesn't actually matter if there are a few more males in your survey than females because we're doing it by percentage. And then what I want to do is I want to figure out, all right, where should I divide this off so that I can show what proportion of the males prefer football. So I'm going to put a little dividing line, and I'm going to use shade in that area to show what proportion of the males likes each of the sports. So one of the first things we need to do is now calculate these percentages. So when I look at that male bar, I need to figure out the percent for 40 out of the 77 that prefer football, 22 out of 77 that prefer basketball, and 15 out of 77 that prefer baseball. And then I need to calculate those two into percent. So I just need to divide. And be careful with your rounding. If you're careful with your rounding, you should end up with things totaling 100%. Sometimes if it's off by a decimal, you just double check your rounding. But so in a minute when I mark these up, I'm going to want to divide this. So a little over half my bar I can label as football. A little over a quarter of the bar will be basketball, and a little about a fifth is baseball. And then I'll do the same thing for the females. So for the females, it's 12 out of the 73 females prefer football, 16 out of the 73 prefer basketball, and 45 out of the 73 prefer baseball. And there are my percentages there. Now, how you label them, as long as we can clearly tell where your marks are, you don't need to be perfect on exactly where those fall. But you should try and estimate as close as you can. For the male bar, it might look something like this. Now I'm doing it with color because it's easier on computer. You can do it just by labeling. You can do it by shading if you want. The only thing I would say is when you go to label the other bar, do it in the same order so that you have football lined up above football, basketball in the middle, and then baseball on the right. It just helps to compare a little bit. But kind of like with that side-by-side bar graph, the nice thing about these is we can compare pretty quickly and see some of those trends. Like clearly there's a much larger piece or larger chunk of the female in the survey that prefer baseball. Males tend to be more preferred among or football tends to be the most preferred among males. So you can see some trends a little more visually. They're a little bit more work to make because you need to do some dividing up, but it's still a relatively quick graph to let us look at two categorical variables at the same time.